Mr. Court is a registered professional geoscientist in the state of Texas. He has extensive experience in the source water assessment and protection, revised total coliform rule, and groundwater rule programs. He received his Bachelor of Science in Geological Sciences from the University of Texas at Austin in 1998. Following his graduation, Matt began his career at the TCQ and is currently a member of the Drinking Water Assessment Team in the Drinking Water Standards section. Please welcome Mr. Court.
All right, thank y'all. Yeah, thanks for being here, and hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. Just want to say a thanks to Mason Miller for putting this together. It's such a great event for us every year to be able to come out and interact with everybody and develop these relationships that have gone on for a while. I see people every year that I've known for 10, 20 years or more, you know. So it's a really good event to have every year, and I appreciate you guys for traveling over here and your time and expenses and everything. So, and in your effort to go out and get educated on all these rules. I know it's overwhelming at times, and there's a lot to learn, and sometimes you end up in a situation where, you know, you've got the rule and you've got your situation out in the field, and maybe things don't quite line up the way you're thinking they should, and that's what I'm here for, is just to assist you and help you navigate these rules. You know, anytime you read rule language, sometimes it can be kind of mind-numbing to try to understand everything that the rules are saying. So that's what we're here for, is to just help guide you through it, and we're all in this together to provide safe drinking water. So again, thank you for being here. We've got the Groundwater Rule. It's one of our microbial rules. It's you know, in the same rule or same part of the rules as the revised total coliform rule, and it's linked to that rule in a couple of different ways, and we'll talk about that. But I'll go ahead and get started. I'll let you know up front, we've got about 37 slides or so to go through, and a lot of material, but jot down notes, anything. If you have any questions at the end, just let me know. So moving ahead, here's a brief outline of what we're going to cover. We've got triggered and assessment source monitoring. We've got trigger source monitoring plans, periodic sanitary surveys. The federal rule refers to our CCIs, or comprehensive compliance investigations, as sanitary surveys. That was kind of the old language, but it's still what they say in the federal rule. So the sanitary surveys and comprehensive compliance investigations are the same thing. And we've got corrective action, concentration time studies, or CT studies. This is a type of treatment that's a little more stringent than just disinfection, and it can allow you to use a well that may be, you know, susceptible to fecal contamination. You want to keep the well in use, and this is a way you can keep that well in use and just treat the water for the E. coli. And then we'll get into the violations and public notification at the end. So just kind of an overview of kind of what the goals are, and for the groundwater rule, it's a risk targeting approach. So this is, you know, accomplished by, you know, periodic sanitary surveys every 3 years for community systems, every 5 for non-community systems, and this is a way to go check the system and make sure there are no significant deficiencies with the water system. So we also have triggered and assessment monitoring. This is the triggered monitoring is like event-based, based on a positive out in distribution through the RTCR program. If you get a positive in distribution, you have to collect your repeat samples, and then you have to also collect well samples. And then if you have any issues with fecal contamination, you'll be required to do some type of corrective action and public notification. So raw well sample preparation, I just wanted to mention this up front. It's really important to have a good standard operating procedure for collecting samples. I'm sure you all have that, where you know, flush the spigot, disinfect it, and collect the sample. Sample siting plans, we had a workshop yesterday on this, and that's really important to define all your sample points, define all your wells, and things like that. That's a requirement under actually the RTCR, but it does include your raw wells. And then we've got, as far as the raw well source monitoring, this is done at the wellhead prior to treatment. And different types of raw well sampling. We've got trigger source monitoring, assessment source monitoring. There's also sometimes you could be in a situation where you have a boil water notice and you have to take a special sample to confirm your disinfection and that the water's okay to use again. Those would be raw samples, but you wouldn't mark those as raw. You'd mark them as special for boil water notices. So I want to emphasize that because there's on the sample form, there's a raw is one of the sample types and special is a sample type. Well, raw is a compliance type that is used for the groundwater rule. Special is special purpose sampling that's you know, if you mark it special, you're not going to get into any kind of compliance loops. It's just something to rescind a boil water notice, you know, most of the time. Or if you just want to do check samples out in the field, marking that sample as special is really important. So like I said, raw sampling is pre-chlorination. We want to, you know, make sure that sample is raw. When you go out and collect a raw sample, you know, you're thinking raw sample, there's a spot on the form for chlorine residual. You're like, well, it's a raw sample. You know, it obviously doesn't have any chlorine, but we do have to measure that out in the field and just confirm it's zero. We want to make sure it's truly a raw sample. Triggered source monitoring samples, this is in response to a distribution positive, and those have to be done within 24 hours. And just a note here, you know, we've had some situations where a system will come back and say, you know, we don't have a sample tap on the wellhead. You know, there's no way to collect a raw sample. There is a requirement in Subchapter D that requires you to have a sample tap. In a couple of situations where somebody didn't have that sample tap, you know, we gave them a couple days extension, they got a plumber out and installed a sample tap. So it led to better, you know, practice for raw sampling. And then that MRF, the microbial monitoring form, it's really important to mark those properly. If you have taken a raw sample, we want to use the well source code, which starts with the letter G, then it's your system ID number, and then there's a letter designation at the end. So just make sure and put that on the sample location, because if you just put well 1 or well 2, something like that, it's going to get rejected through our data system. So those can be corrected in the, you know, on the back end, but it may result in a violation going out initially. So really important on the MRF to fill those out right. Something we also see is a sample will come back and it's marked raw and special. We have to use the compliance type. It kind of supersedes the non-compliance type. So, you know, if you mark it both ways, we're going to consider that a compliance raw sample. So just wanted to make the note of that to make sure, and just for raw samples, either only raw or only special, whatever your purpose of sampling is. Okay, so raw well source monitoring, just make sure you have a good procedure for collecting samples. You've got the sample siting plan, boil water notice situations, and has to be done at the wellhead. So getting into the first part of groundwater rule sampling, we've got assessment source monitoring. These are situations where you may have an as-built well or something, you know, previously used as an irrigation well or something, and you want to bring that on as a public well, and you don't meet all the construction standards. So our technical review team will, you know, review that and give you an exception to that rule. But as a condition of that, you have to do monthly sampling in your well. So it's a way, you know, it is kind of a burden to take these monthly samples, but it does allow you to use a well that is, you know, maybe substandard in construction. For any system, you can actually use, say you have to do a monthly raw sample, and you do your monthly sample and your distribution sample on, you know, around the same time. You get a positive in distribution, and you've collected this assessment sample for the month. If it's within 24 hours of that positive in distribution, you can still use that as your triggered sample. So, and this is one of the rare cases where, you know, we can allow a dual purpose type sample. If you have any questions on that in the field, or you've got an assessment sample that was collected close to a positive, you can give me a call and just make sure that we're all good with that. But, you know, it's basically saving you an extra trip out there. Triggered source monitoring, this is probably the most activity we get with a rule. It is, you know, linked to the RTCR. So you get a positive in distribution, and you have to collect raw sample from each well within 24 hours, each well that was in use. So if you have a well that was offline, we can document that, and you wouldn't have to sample that well. There is an allowance for sampling at alternative locations. There's a few rare situations where systems have multiple wells flowing into a storage tank, and that storage tank is still raw, it would be it's a type of common header type sample. We've allowed some sampling there, but so if you get a positive in distribution, instead of going out and sampling all the wells, in some cases you can just sample that raw tank. But the only thing with that is if you get a positive in the tank, then you're going to have to go back and sample all the wells and figure out which one was having the issue. Triggered source monitoring applies to any groundwater sources or any systems that provide groundwater that's not treated to at least 4 log standards. Some systems we see are surface water and they have a couple of wells. Some of them actually run their well water through the surface plant, and if that's the case, then you would be exempt from the groundwater rule. But most systems bypass the groundwater well, around, just do disinfection on it. So if that's the case and it's not treated to those surface standards or 4 log treatment, then you're still going to have to collect those raw samples in those situations. And these are also, it's the same as the repeat monitoring. So you got 24 hours, from the time of notification to go out and collect your raw samples. Sometimes this can be pretty challenging out there if you've got, 10 wells or more. It can be really difficult to go out and get all those samples within the required time frame. So we do have a way to reduce the amount of raw samples through a triggered source monitoring plan, and we'll talk about that a little bit more coming up. I wanted to mention this triggered source monitoring is a one-to-one relationship with distribution positives to raw samples that are required. So for each distribution positive, you have to collect a full set of raw samples. So I actually have a situation going on now with a system that I think they had 3 positives in the same day. They only went out and did 1 round of well sampling and got a violation. I know just kind of intuitively you might think, okay, it's just 1 trip out there and we'll collect 1 round of raw samples and we're good, but it's set up that each time you get a positive, you have to do a full set of raw samples. It's just like the repeats. For each distribution positive, you have to collect 3 repeat samples. It's a one-to-one thing. So, this example I gave, so if a system has 5 distribution positives, 5 samples must be collected from each well that was in use. So that could be, 25 samples. So early on in the rule, we had a couple of people that were kind of contesting this part of the rule, and I had meetings with EPA, and it went all the way up to EPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and they came back, and it's supposed to be each positive requires a full round of raw sampling. And their explanation was that, yes, they did collect all the raw samples from all the wells, but when you do it one-to-one, it is more data, and any data is good data. So that's the way they see it, and that's the way we have been implementing the rules. So, the only time this could cause confusion is if you have multiple positives in the same day. If you have a positive at the first of the month, you're going to go do your raw samples. A couple weeks later, you get another positive in distribution, you're going to go out and take another round of raw samples. So, if they're all in the same day, just keep that in mind that you still have to do a round of raw samples for each positive. It does apply to consecutive systems, providers and wholesalers, and purchasers. So say you're a system that you purchase groundwater from another system and you get a positive in your distribution system, well, you don't have any wells to sample, so you have to notify that provider within 24 hours. And then from 24 hours of that, they have to go sample the wells. So, communication is real important with this, and make sure you have good, if you do purchase water or sell water, make sure you have good communication with your consecutive systems, because, this 24-hour clock starts and it's, not a lot of time to deal with out there. There are some exceptions to trigger source monitoring. The first being is if you get that distribution positive invalidated, then all the requirements go away once the invalidation is granted. So that's one situation. Another one is if you feel like there's a distribution deficiency. Just a simple example would be, say you collected a sample and there's a construction going on near that sample, and you feel like, this construction interfered with the quality of the water at that location. You can provide documentation and let us know that, hey, I think this was a distribution deficiency, and we don't feel like we should have to sample the raw wells. We feel like it was this distribution issue. And that's happened a couple of times. We don't see that a lot, but it is in the rule, and So keep that in mind too. Make sure, that's another thing going back to sampling. If you do have some construction going on, it'd probably be best to skip that area and collect from a different area. So trigger source monitoring plans, this is a way for large systems to cut down on those raw sample requirements that you would have in a triggered event. A couple of big systems that come to mind that have really complex trigger source monitoring plans are City of Houston, San Antonio Water System. They've got really complex systems, and they, up front, the beginning of the rule in 2009, they submitted these trigger source monitoring plans, and it really allows them to operate in a realistic way without having to collect so many raw samples. So there are basically 3 compliance options. There's trigger source monitoring. Say you've just got a one well system. I mean, there's no need to do a trigger source monitoring plan. You just, in a triggered event, you go collect your raw sample. Or you can choose as an option to submit a trigger source monitoring plan to basically name representative wells. So, and then there's 4-log treatment is a more stringent treatment process that you just treat the water through a CT study, and it requires ground storage. This will allow you to just be exempt from the groundwater rule, basically. So we have some systems that are set up like that just, they may get some total coliform in their well or an occasional E. coli, but they just do the more stringent treatment to keep that well going. Trigger source monitoring plan reduces the required trigger source samples, and it can save a lot of time and resources. So the first type of trigger source monitoring plan is wells that represent specific coliform monitoring locations in the distribution system. This example, it's a real simple example coming up that I'll show you, but it's for basically systems that have multiple pressure planes or that have isolated distribution areas. You've got separated by either a valve or miles apart that wells don't interfere with or interact with the other part of the distribution. In those cases, we'd like to document that and just show that, hey, well A goes over here, well B goes over here, so if you get a positive over here, you just have to sample that well. So this is a little schematic of that. Basically have a distribution system with 2 pressure planes. So in this case, you've got 3 wells in the upper plane and 3 in the lower plane and a valve separating the 2. So if you get a positive up in that north area, you would only have to sample the red wells indicated in well field A. But you have to have the trigger source monitoring plan approved and in place to be able to do that, but it can cut your sampling in half. The second option for a triggered plan is to, if you have a well field and you want to, say you got 10 wells out in a close proximity, they're all similar depths from the same aquifer, you could name one well to represent that whole well field. So that could cut you, down from 10 to 1. So, I'll take a look at if you're interested in that, and I'll take a look at all the well reports and make sure all the depths are similar, aquifers are similar, geology's all the same, obviously, if they're within a close proximity. And yeah, you could name, one well to represent that well field. In the example given here, we've got 3 different well fields. You had a positive. This is just one pressure plane. So if they get a positive, normally they would have to do, 9 well samples there. But since they've identified representative wells in each well field, it cuts it down to 3. So really good option there. And we can also combine these 2. We can, let me get to the combination one here, is we can name the red well in the north plane is representing the 3 in the north. And then it also, we know that it's in the upper plane. So in this case, you would reduce from 6 well samples to 1. So yeah, we can, if you have wells that represent other wells, or you want to show wells that represent coliform monitoring sites, we can do a combination plan. I've got a checklist for each of those options. So if you're interested, we can go through and I can give you an idea of what all is required to put together that plan. But it really can be helpful, especially for systems with multiple wells. So kind of shift in focus here to more of the sanitary survey part of it. This is a part of the rule where the region inspectors go out and do a inspection on your water system. And there's 8 elements here of a sanitary survey. If there are any issues within any of these areas, they could determine that, okay, I think this is a significant deficiency that would possibly allow fecal or bacteriological contamination into the water system. If that happens, you get a violation in your inspection and they check it off that it's significant deficiency. You'd basically have 120 days to correct that. And if everything goes okay and you correct it, then there's no further action. If you don't correct it within the time frame, that it could be a violation there. The corrective action part of this rule is in 291.16. Basically, if you get E. coli positive in your raw well, or if you get a significant deficiency, you would have to do corrective action. For an E. coli sample, you have to do a 24-hour public notice. Significant deficiencies cause or have the potential to cause the introduction of contamination into the water delivered to customers. So, it could be anything from a line break, or, you've got an issue with your tanks or your pumps or anything that could prevent, the system from operating normally. And there are defined rule citations that for each of those 8 categories for the groundwater rule. So the regional inspector will let you know that, hey, this is a significant deficiency and you have to correct this within X number of days. In 291.16, there are 6 corrective action options. The first 4 were part of the federal rule. That's, when we write rules, we have to make sure our state rules are reflective of everything within the federal rule. And so we have that, and we also added number 5 and 6, which is well disinfection and assessment source monitoring. We wanted to, provide some types of corrective actions that were kind of a little more realistic to, you can't always just eliminate the well, you can't always eliminate the source of contamination. Sometimes, it's best to just, hey, they had 1 E. coli positive, let's disinfect the well and move on. And if it becomes a recurring thing, then we might have to step up to one of the other corrective actions. But we wanted to have the well disinfection in place because it's a way, to address an acute situation in a quick way, and it's less impactful on the water system. And we could also say, hey, you got an E. coli positive, this is maybe the second one you've had in a couple of years. We may think it's a good option to go ahead and start collecting monthly samples out of that well just to see what the yearly trend would be through all the seasonality of the year, just to get a good idea. If multiple raw E. coli positives are collected within a, say, rolling 12 months, then, we'll start looking at something like 4-log treatment. And that's happened, not a huge amount of times, but it does happen from time to time, and it's we'll talk about it more coming up. It's can be kind of a burden to deal with 4-log treatment, but it is a good way to keep a well going that instead of drilling a new well. So going into 4-log treatment here, 4-log just means 99.99% inactivation of viruses, which bacteria would be taken care of with that also. The way you accomplish that is through, most commonly, free chlorine is the way to go. Chloramines could possibly work, but it's not as strong as a disinfectant, so you just have to have basically a lot of storage capacity to be able to pull that off. One system I can think of offhand they get their water from another system, and they have 62 miles of pipe to get that water to their system. We actually did a CT study and allowed them to get contact time in that 62 miles, and it actually worked out with them with chloramines. So it has happened a few times out there, but generally speaking, groundwater systems usually use free chlorine, and that's the most effective way to get 4-log treatment. And so, like I mentioned earlier, if you're doing 4-log treatment, that well is pretty much exempt from the groundwater rule. I mean, if you have a positive out in distribution, you don't have to do anything. You just have to monitor that residual every day in your plant. And it could be used as a corrective action, but you'll only see that if it's, a recurring E. coli issue. I mean, if you get, say you're collecting monthly raw samples and it's like every month you're getting an E. coli, then, we're going to have to step up to a more stringent treatment process. So it can be a corrective action. I'd say pretty rare that happens. Usually, we just disinfect the well and are able to move on, and, we don't see a lot of recurring issues with that. And just one thing to note also is, you may be in a situation where you're getting multiple E. colis and you don't want to do 4-log treatment, but if you have a storage tank and you're running pretty strong residual. I mean, the chances are you're probably getting 4-log treatment already. It's just a matter of getting approved CT study and then doing the daily monitoring on it. So it's more of a record-keeping thing. But yeah, a lot of systems are already set up for it. When we have a challenge is if it's a really small system and they don't have storage, it's kind of a lot to ask to get set up to do that. But the flip side is drilling a new well, or having to interconnect with another system, something like that. The requirements for 4-log is you have to get the 4-log treatment approved, which is through a CT study. I'll show you a diagram of basically our CT study. It's pretty much a 2-page thing where you just fill in a couple of blanks. You put in your capacity and your pumping capacity, and the form kind of does the work for you and tells you what your residual is going to be. You do have to maintain monthly operating reports. We don't ask you to send those in every month, but if you have an E. coli positive, we're going to ask for it. We could ask for it for other situations too, but usually if there's an E. coli positive and it's a 4-log system, we're going to request that MOR. So yeah, and another thing to note too is sometimes when you get approved for 4-log treatment, if you have a huge storage tank, I mean, you may come out with a residual of 0.1 or less, to maintain that 4-log. You just still have to, once you get in, once you run it through the plant, if it's say 0.1, you're going to have to boost that before you go out to distribution, because the distribution requirement is different. It's 0.2 for free and 0.5 for total. There are a few systems out there that have really low residual requirements for 4-log, and we just have to remind them hey, you got to boost that before it goes to distribution. To apply for 4-log, it goes through our corrosion control team. It used to be the technical review and oversight team, and that switched over, but it's the corrosion control, and I forget the full name of that team. But yeah, you would submit a CT study basically, and then they'll do an approval or a denial, let you know if you have any kind of requirements that you need to do to the plant to be able to get approved. And it also requires a basic schematic that just shows your well, your injection point, your storage, and then your entry point. This is the CT template, and the yellow fields are the only ones that you have to fill in. It's basically total capacity, all the storage tank capacity, and then your service pump capacity, how much water you flowing through those tanks. And then at the bottom, it'll give you a milligrams per liter for that number will be what you have to maintain in that tank to get 4-log treatment. And it's basically just a way to allow the water to interact with that disinfectant for a longer period of time, which increases the inactivation rate of any kind of bacteria. It's a really good way to treat the water and keep that well in use. So yeah, this is the team name, Corrosion Control and Disinfection Protocol Team. It has to be done in writing, and then the MSR, or the minimum residual, has to be maintained daily. And this is the threshold without a requirement. So population of 3,300 or more, you have to continuously monitor. So you have to have some kind of CL17 or something going to continuously monitor, which is, could be expensive to set up, but it can also save, a lot of man hours to physically going out there and collecting grab samples. If you're less than 3,300, then you do have to do that daily grab sample. And if you're less than 3,300 and you want to run a continuous monitor, that's fine too. If the budget allows, that's really the best way to deal with 4-log treatment is through continuous monitoring. You can do a lot of remote monitoring also. So say you opted to do 4-log treatment. It wasn't a corrective action or anything like that. You just wanted to do it just to be exempt from the groundwater rule. And if you ever want to discontinue that, you're like, oh, we hardly get any positives in distribution. We don't get many positives in the well. We just want to go back to just straight triggered source monitoring. Then that's fine. You just have to submit that in writing to that same team to get that requirement off of your system. But like I said, that's only if it's a voluntary thing. If it's a corrective action, you still have to keep doing it. So moving into our groundwater rule treatment technique violations, if you get a significant deficiency identified from the region and that's not corrected or completed within 120 days or within a plan and schedule, sometimes if the corrective action whatever the region or we tell you you need to do to correct it, if that's going to take more time than 120 days, we can work with you on that. But we just have to, get together and figure out what the feasible time frame would be. If that's the case, then that would be considered your CA plan and schedule. Another way to get a treatment technique violation is failure to maintain the 4-log treatment. We did have a system recently that had been on the books for 4-log for a while. They had an E. coli positive, and so we requested that MOR, and they, were skipping days and not recording their flow rate, and, the MSR was under, their measured residual was under the MSR a couple days. I mean, it resulted in a treatment technique violation, but we were able to talk to that system a lot and really educate them on how they're supposed to do it. They did it for a full month after that, sent it back in, it was perfect. So, it resulted in a violation in public notice, but they did, learn how to do it properly in the end. So those are the treatment technique violations. 24-hour public notice requirement, that is when you have an E. coli positive in your well. It can be through triggered source monitoring or assessment source monitoring. If you've got a well sample that's marked raw, then it's pretty much on the hook for that 24-hour public notice. If that ever occurs, we will talk to you and immediately be on the phone with you and letting you know. We'll send an email with all the documentation that you need to provide, and we're on top of that immediately. Probably a good time to mention my coworker, Ken Quinney, back here. He works with me. We do the Groundwater Rule together. We also have some RTCR folks here, and they have done a great job at learning our rule, and we have weekly meetings together. This, probably the last, couple of years we've been doing weekly Groundwater Rule RTCR meetings, and it's really been good. We've all gotten on the same page, and there's a lot of crossover now with, we're in there mixing it up, understanding what each other are dealing with, and RTCR has been great with learning the Groundwater Rule, and but yeah, Ken, I mean, he's awesome. He is on top of things, and he usually is on the front line with the E. coli positives. So if you get an E. coli positive, chances are you're going to hear from Ken or maybe me as well. But yeah, it's Ken and I do the Groundwater Rule, and that 24-hour notice can happen quick, and you got to get that out as quick as possible. But yeah, we'll provide you with that language and everything to use. The 30-day public notice, this is more of you failed to implement, say you didn't do the well disinfection for an E. coli positive, or you had a significant deficiency, you didn't maintain the 4-log treatment, things like that is the 30-day public notice. And then the 12-month, this is the Tier 3 notice, and this is the one that's associated with your either trigger source monitoring or monthly assessment source monitoring. It's just a monitoring violation. It has to be done within 12 months, and that can be done on your CCR. So you can, it's got the 12-month window there. You can just put it on your CCR, but just make sure, we get the proof of that, so we can document it. And speaking of CCR, the things that you would be required to put on your CCR is if you get a significant deficiency and your CCR comes up before you've corrected it, then you just have to mention on that you have a uncorrected significant deficiency. And then once you correct that significant deficiency, it has to be noted on the CCR. And then any E. coli positives you get would be required to be put in that CCR. A couple of reminders. This is a big one. Say you've got 5 wells and you have a triggered event. We're just going to see that you have 5 wells, and we're going to schedule your raw sampling for those 5 wells. If you have a triggered event, you had a couple of wells that were offline, let us know as quick as you can, and we'll set up that schedule for, say, 2 or 3 wells or whatever you had running instead of the 5. If you let us know up front, then we'll schedule it appropriately. If you kind of wait and it results in a notice of violation, we can still fix that on the backside, but you're still going to have to go through getting the notice of violation and everything. But yeah, we have a form that you can fill out that just documents that a well was offline, and we'll take that off the schedule. 4-log treatment and trigger source monitoring plans are options with the rule. It's a way to deal with with the rule a little easier. You know, 4-log can be a corrective action as well, but 4-log treatment can be a voluntary thing just to be exempt from the rule, and then trigger source monitoring plans is an option to allow you to have to sample less wells in a triggered event, basically. And communication, just let us know if you have any issues, any questions. And I also wanted to mention here, FMT, this is a really great program. We've used this several times with 4-log systems that are new to 4-log treatment, and we can send somebody out there that actually shows you how to monitor, fill out the form, everything you need to do. So, and that's a free service. Please reach out if you need help with that. And then here's our contact information. You're probably all familiar with Drinking Water Watch. That's our web version of our database. It's synced up with our database, so you can see up-to-date information about your system, any violations, positives, things like that. And my direct email and the GWR data goes to myself and Ken, also our team leader, Claire. Any of those contact points, just let us know if you have any questions. And that's pretty much what I have. Does anybody have any questions? I think we got 5 minutes. Okay. Yeah, I don't see any hands going up. All right. Thank y'all. Appreciate it.